Hello to Le Monde and welcome to Du Jour, where we as British girls are forgiven just this once for, well, first of all, talking about food history because when no one asked, and also for saying very French things in British accents. We are not sponsored by Flat Whites. Why are we not sponsored by Flat Whites, Ruby?
Well, we're not
So
sponsored by
rude.
Flat Whites because we don't have a sponsor. If anyone would like to sponsor us, you would be very welcome to. But
Don't take
specifically, we are
notice.
not sponsored by Flat Whites this week because this week we're going to be talking about coffee. We're going to
Coffee.
be looking at when coffee became du jour, the advent of coffee houses, the drink itself, when it became popular in the UK or Britain, and how it became a sort of a channel for new spaces around politics and commerce and philosophy, and how it now acts for us as sort of a locus for a third space. But also, as with all things in food history, it allows us to talk about sense history and sense-based approaches to history and their importance.
Yes. And well, we'll kind of see and unpack a bit more why this sort of sense-based idea and approach to history is so significant for coffee, if it might not already be a bit evident. But when I was researching for this podcast, I got very excited because I made the realization, and maybe this was already evident before, but there is so much music written about coffee, and I think there has to be a reason for that. So we have Bach's cantata, dating all the way back to Lovely Bar, all the way to jazz, some black coffee, um, and then of course more recently Sabrina Carpenter's espresso. So there's been lots of music written about coffee throughout history.
I hadn't
So
even thought about Espresso by Sabrina Carpenter. Like that in my mind exists entirely in 2025.
well, I
Mm.
think you should more. It's a reminder. It's
Yeah.
a great summer bop as we enter the summer where it is cloudy and a bit grey at the moment. But anyway, lots of music written about coffee, and I think
Oh,
hopefully this episode will show why and how coffee has always been so perennially important to so many.
yes, and coffee remains important to so many across the globe. And you had a fun fact about
I
how
have a
much
fun
coffee we
fact.
drink.
Thank you for reminding me, Ruby. So, according to a precocious 10-year-old boy that I babysit, um, 2.3 million coffees are drunk every minute. Like that is a lot of
Every
coffee.
minute.
Every minute, every
That's like
minute.
like, I mean, this is where my maths is going to be terrible, but that's like 2% of the world's population is having a coffee every minute. That's crazy.
I'm going to trust you with that. Well, I'm
You
contributing to it
definitely
because
shouldn't, but yeah.
well, I do anyway. It's too late now.
This is Ruby in editing mode, and I Googled it, and 2.3 million is actually 0.002% of the current world's population. So I stand by what I said. May should not have trusted me on this. My maths was way off. Apologies. I still think that 2.3 million coffees a minute is an awful lot of coffee.
I
Oh
have a
no.
coffee right by my side now,
Oh,
so
well,
that
I've
will
got a
keep
cup
me.
of tea.
Well, lovely, lovely. Our nervous systems are about here at the moment, the imbalance.
Perfect. But yeah, this is it. I think I've been excited about doing this episode for a while,
Mm.
mostly because it's sort of when coffee became du jour is sort of my era because my primary era for historical research is the early modern and it became du jour in the 16th century. And that means that whilst doing the research for this episode, I got to read lots of 16th century and 17th century
Oh
sources,
yeah.
which are some of the most fun things to read. And so we've got quite a lot of primary sources that illustrate the place that coffee sort of came to have in British society and give us a few angles for some questions to unpack. So,
Totally.
one of these sources is by a poet and writer called Thomas Jordan, and it's part of a poem called The Triumphs of London, which was written in 1675. And there's a line, well, a section of lines in it that say, "There is nothing done in all the world, from the monarch to the mouse, but every day or night is hurled into the coffee house." And aside from it being like a lovely little rhyme, like this is 1675, it's the height of the Restoration in England. So when Charles II has returned from across the waters and vanquished the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell, who had chopped off the head of his father. And now we've got
Yay.
coffee houses exploding onto the political scene, and coffee houses are this place where debate takes place, and there's so much to debate at this time. You've got the beginnings of sort of mutterings in France about different sort of revolutionary ideas and different philosophies. And so there's nothing done in all the world that isn't discussed in a coffee house. But coffee isn't just a political grandstanding moment, it is also a drink, and it
Yeah.
has a taste. That is a taste that I hate. I think that coffee is horrible.
And you are, I think, very correct, even though I love coffee. I mean, because if you think about it objectively, it's not anything controversial, but there's a reason why when we were all, 10, 9, 8 years old, maybe younger, if you're kind of from the continent, you have your first sip of coffee and you're like, that's disgusting. It kind of tastes rank. Um, but it's interesting because, like so many foodstuffs, like it's not just coffee, it's alcohol as well. These drinks have, despite that, become so popular and perennially popular throughout time. So this kind of question of, hey, why do we kind of like gross things? This was remarked upon in the kind of mid 17th century when coffee was really sort of starting to grow in popularity more in the UK. So we have Henry Blount, a British knight, who I will try to imitate him in my best 17th century accent. Well, he says, universally, both tobacco and coffee take with mankind, and yet not the advantage of any pleasing taste, wherewith to tempt and debauch our palate. Yet they are so generally prevail that bread itself is not of so universal use. So essentially just kind of being like, yeah, I mean, isn't it kind of weird?
Yeah, they don't
Coffee's
taste nice,
coffee's
but
kind of
everyone's
popular,
obsessed with
tobacco's not,
them.
but yeah, but it tastes disgusting, and yet we rely on it more than bread. So I think that's really interesting, and it's not just a question of, it makes the history angle more interesting, in terms of like, okay, how did this kind of gross drink become so popular? But also, if you think about it from in terms of we're talking about it arriving in the British Isles, this was a product that was non-European. It came from the Ottoman Empire, sort of it arrived from the Ottoman Empire in like the mid 17th century or early 17th century. Brits were skeptical of anything that was non-European and foreign. So it makes it even more, sort of remarkable how coffee grew in popularity.
Yeah, but there were sort of practical reasons that coffee became popular, and one of those is that it was actually a very cheap alternative to the other thing that people were mostly drinking, which was ale. So, again, another 17th century source. As ale prices were rising due to taxation and sort of some poor harvests, that meant that wheat and other things used in ale, like hops and barley, were more expensive, and therefore ale was more expensive. We have a source that says, but in a coffee house for a penny or two, you may spend 2 or 3 hours. So this coffee is sort of a product that you can spend not very much money on, but actually you can hang out with your friends for quite a long time. And you also get quite a lot of criticism from people who ran ale houses or sold ale about coffee. So there's a fantastic text which you should all go away and Google and read because it's really fun. But I'm not going to read out. Called "The Ale Wives' Complaint Against the Coffee Houses," and that's another source from London in 1675. Now, some debate has been generated about whether this was actually by the ale wives or whether it was a political text, ostensibly written by the ale wives to get people to stop drinking coffee. But there's no doubt that there was sort of a taste distinction and a monetary distinction in coffee, and people were sort of flocking towards coffee rather than ale, in part because it was cheaper. But now that we've looked at some primary sources about coffee, let's get to grips with the actual history of coffee when it came to the UK and sort of how it took off. And for that, I'm going to hand over to you, May.
Yes. So, I'm very excited to start what might become a regular recurring theme in these episodes. A 30-second sweep of the entire history of any theme ever. So here, our 30-second sweep will be looking, kind of giving a quick timeline of when coffee arrived in sort of, well, early modern history and its general sweep until now. Warning, it will be longer than 30 seconds, but I love it. The fact that it's called 30-second sweep, not least because it reminds me of the TV show Supermarket Sweep. Shout out, shout out to you, Clover, is what I'll say. Brings back many memories of lockdown that maybe I don't want to be reminded of, but they existed nonetheless. So let's start with the 30-second sweep. So, as mentioned before, coffee was kind of really unknown sort of within the British Isles until around the mid 15th century, and then really kind of started to take off in the 16th century, so 17th century rather. So our kind of it arrived from sort of across the Red Sea, Ottoman Empire, to the UK or to England. Our first kind of consumers of coffee, we're looking at sort of starting from 1600s up until like the sort of mid 1650s. Um, our first coffee house in the UK or England was opened in Oxford, 1650, which might
Stay
be
tuned
featured
for
a
a
bit
segment
later.
later.
Stay
Yeah.
tuned. And by the 60s and 70s, there were already comments on how habitual coffee houses it became, bearing in mind this is primarily male, sort of a male audience of the kind of upper middle class. An important note to kind of mention, and something that will maybe contextualize our analysis for later, is when we're moving towards the kind of from the mid 1650s to 1688, we are in the Restoration period. So that is to say, after England's sort of civil war and its brief period as a republic, we have the reinstatement again of the monarchy, so Charles II. In trying to do this, because civil war and a republic, it's they're not calm, stable political conditions, and this is this attempt to then bring order with the reinstatement of the monarchy again. The authorities are really going to be trying to keep the masses calm and sort of try to reinstate order again. Whether that works or not, that's also to be seen. But yes, anyway, so the Restoration period, that's 1660, 1688. And again, kind of we'll talk about this later in our analysis, but because of the fact that the authorities were really sort of on the lookout, especially, and also we're talking about the arrival of foreign product, it was controversial. When coffee arrived in the UK, it was a controversial product. However, this gradually became more normalized, and by 1720, it's generally accepted that coffee consumption was firmly ingrained in British society, and sufficiently anglicized.
Yes. And once coffee had become thus anglicized and ingrained, it sort of experienced a bit of a dip. Maybe we're a controversy seeking country. Maybe we are actually just sort of chasing after
I
the
think
latest
that might
trends.
be the answer,
But
yeah.
the sort of explosion of coffee houses that then sort of petered down and they became sort of mundane and everyday. We then got an explosion in two other types of houses. A type of house and a type of palace. So the tea houses, tea became a huge thing. This was partially, or sort of actually mostly, because of the expansion of the British Empire. In the 1720s, we had the opening of regular Canton trade in China. We had the East India Company established in 1717. Indian tea was a colonial product, so it was actually quite cheap for British people, though not at first, compared to coffee that was grown outside of the empire, and it became associated with patriotism because it came from our colonies. And then also during the Industrial Revolution, tea became ubiquitous across the classes, rather than just being something that was genteelly purchased in tea houses or drunk at home in teapots. It became sort of the staple of the working class masses. So tea with milk and sugar was a cheap and calorific drink for workers that was served in urban factories. And that's where sort of we get the idea of the builder's tea, right? Like this really strong,
The
really
builder's brew.
sweet, solid brew that's associated still today with the working classes.
5
But it
sugars,
also
please.
retained, yeah. And again, shout out to Clover. And again, but it also, despite becoming this like sort of working class product, it retained its imperial sort of connotations, and therefore it was considered genteel. The patriotism meant that you could serve it out of your China tea service in your drawing room of your rural or city centre house, just as the workers down the road were having a cup of tea so strong you could stand a teaspoon up in it. The other thing, though, as I said, we had tea houses, but we had a type of palace, and that type of palace was the gin palace. Is that
Indeed.
right?
Yes, and I now know, having done this research, why I went through such a big, well, Brits love gins generally, but I went through a horrible pink gin phase. It was unashamed, but I can look at it as part of
Every
our
student
roots.
goes there, May.
It's
We
true,
all
it's true, but it doesn't make it better. Anyway, so we have also, in terms of kind of popular drinks, this gin craze in the mid 18th century where gin consumption increases massively. It's seen as a problem. Parliament passes five major acts to try to control it. And we see as well with this does have an effect on coffee consumption, coffee houses, because already with the kind of increase in uptake in tea, coffee houses become slightly less of a thing, but also coffee houses and pubs, they kind of start to blend their offerings a bit. So in terms of they start to kind of offer a bit of alcohol, a bit of coffee. So this identity of the coffee house that we really see and that we'll kind of go into when it first arrived continues to decline. We then kind of get to the Victorian era where things change a bit more, and we'll be addressing this in small plates. But for now, just think of coffee houses, not really so much of a thing, not really popular in the UK. 20th century, we have two world wars, quite significant. One of the maybe less significant things about it, instant coffee becomes more popular as a result of these two major world wars. And then looking towards more of the sort of post war period, so post Second World War, we see a revival again of coffee houses, but this time as espresso bars, kind of known as this 1950s espresso revolution. This is something I'll be talking about a bit more later as well, but that is kind of to say, now when we associate coffee more with Italy, that's kind of when that really started in the UK, so sort of 1950s. And then fast forward to maybe something that looks even more familiar. We have our big multinational corporations. So Starbucks first was set up in the UK in 1998, and then comes Starbucks or Costas, which honestly could warrant an episode in itself because that story is also quite interesting and quite dark. But
oh
yes, so that ends our 30-second sweep. I would like to count how long that was. Maybe it should be a kind of thing of how much over 30
yeah.
seconds we go each time.
Give ourselves a score.
Exactly. But Ruby, considering all of this, what makes this all so interesting? We're kind of given a timeline of all of this,
Mhm.
but why is this worth talking about?
Well, I think what we've seen from our 30-second or maybe 4-minute sweep is that coffee houses across time function sort of as different types of social space. And to be somebody who frequents coffee houses, the meaning of that changes over time as well. So to be a coffee drinker means becoming a type of person, but that type of person is different in the 1670s as it is in the 1850s or the 1910s or the early 2000s. And history is ultimately about space as much as it is about sort of concrete events. And it's about the identities that people inhabit when they take up those spaces. And coffee houses are a really fun example of that.
Totally, totally. And we see, well, kind of since their kind of inception within sort of England, Britain, there is an immediate kind of adaptation of what sort of functions coffee houses play. So one that was less obvious for me when I first started doing this research, but I thought was, very interesting, was commerce. Because if you think about it now, you go to work, we have our offices, weren't so much of a thing. We didn't really have corporate London with the skyscrapers in the 17th century. We did, however, have the opening of coffee shops. So they became a space for business and commercial exchange. So, fun fact, if you are from the British Isles, you'll be very familiar with Lloyd's Bank, the Black Horse,
Oh, I love that
says it
horse.
all.
I love
The
their
insurers and
adverts.
bankers, I know, they make me emotional. They make me emotional. That all began as a coffee house. It all started within a coffee house, and then eventually it became, sort of known for the banking and the black horses that we know today. So
That's so
I thought that
interesting.
was quite
I think,
interesting.
you said, like, today we have offices. Some of us have offices. Some of us have offices that we can only go to 2 or 3 days a week. And I work from home,
Mm.
from my coffee shop that's at the end of my road 2 days a week. So it's kind of sort
Yeah,
of swung in sort of full circle in terms of, like, it began
totally,
as places that
totally.
people did commerce, and now they have sort of reverted to places that people do commerce. Um, but I think, as you say, that's the idea of them as a place of commerce is less well known, and probably the most significant sort of space that they came to inhabit was the function that coffee houses held when they first became du jour as a space for intellectual discourse and sort of political exchange. So in the 1670s, you get the sort of explosion of coffee houses, and coffee houses become a place where you have pamphlets and periodicals, because you want people to have something to read whilst they're drinking their hot drinks, and you want people to stay longer, so you want them to have lots to read, and you want it to be interesting things to read. And what's interesting is, scandal and notoriety and current affairs. And the fact that coffee houses are these places where you can go and read about what's happening in government, what's happening in France, what some slight crackpot maybe has written and had printed with his opinions about what's happening in London and France, means that they become a space that becomes associated with political discourse. And they
Totally.
become a place where men of all different social groups can come together. So there's a pamphlet from 1673 called The Character of a Coffee House, which describes, and I quote, "As you have a hodgepodge of drinks, such too is your company." So this is very mixed company in coffee houses. And the there's further sort of evidence of this sort of development of an intellectual culture around coffee houses. Another pamphlet, News from the Coffee House, from 1667, says that it's, again, quote, "the poor man's university." So it's a place where you can go if you're not of the university classes, and you can discuss and you can learn, and you can learn from authorities. And probably the most sort of substantial evidence for coffee houses taking on this character as places for political discourse is actually the response of the government and the politicians to them. So
Mm.
when sort of Charles II comes back into power, he issues quite a lot of decrees about coffee houses. And in 1675, he suppresses them, and he issues a decree for the suppression of coffee houses, which says, the the multitude of coffee houses of late years set up have produced very evil and dangerous effects. Many therein misspend their time, and in such houses, and by meetings of such persons therein, diverse false, malicious, and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government. So the king is rattled by the fact that people are going and having a cup of coffee and chatting mostly about him. So there is a lot of concern. An
As I
interesting sort of,
summarized in the notes, there was
yes,
beef.
there was beef. There was beef between the king and his coffee
Yes.
drinking subjects. An interesting thing actually about the decree against coffee houses from Charles II is that it it forbids the selling of coffee in coffee houses and in private houses, but it also forbids the selling of chocolate, sherbet, and tea. So coffee houses are not just for coffee. There are other drinks being drunk here. And most significantly, it's not about the coffee, it's about the fact that people are coming together to discuss.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
over time, the discussion becomes a little bit less political, some have argued. So Klein argues that the coffee houses took on a slightly more positive reputation after 1688, once Charles II was more secure, and then following the Glorious Revolution, when British society had calmed down a bit and become a bit less obsessed with what was going on in France. There was sort of a vision of polite society where people met to genteelly discuss things. And again, as May mentioned earlier, by the mid 1700s, sort of by 1720 and 1730s, coffee had ceased to have this kind of daring oriental sort of foreign appeal, and alongside that, discussions about like politics and stuff seemed to have died down as well. So we have all of this evidence that coffee houses became spaces where people took on sort of the identity of political actors, where they were having these malicious conversations, or they were sort of stepping outside of the bounds of being sort of lower class or uneducated. They were becoming these sort of universities. But what was it about coffee houses as opposed to, for example, pubs? Like we've always had pubs.
Yeah.
Pubs have always been places that people go into and
Mm,
chat and talk. But what was it about coffee houses, May, that allowed
yeah.
people to like take on that identity of like the intellectual elite, and attracted people that wanted to take on that identity?
I mean, it kind of goes back to quite the simple fact that drinking coffee, it's a sobering and literally kind of a very, buzzy experience, right? So here we go back to, there's a reason why the authorities they were so skeptical of sort of coffee houses and their the ability to bring, you have all these different kind of intellectual sources and people kind of discussing ideas, is because when you drink a cup of coffee, you become more sober, you become more alert, your brain starts wiring a million, miles per minute. It's all to do with the physical effects of how coffee tastes, or, that's kind of the general working theory. It's more sobering, whereas drinking beer is not so much. Is not so much. Maybe more of a kind of convivial, relaxing time, but less likely to start another revolution, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Well,
You'd have too
depending,
much of
but
a hangover the next day
well,
to
exactly,
be
to
doing any
follow
political
through. So even
planning.
if you write your plan on a napkin, the next day you're like, oh, what did I say again? But it's interesting because these kind of different physical effects of kind of what caffeine does to you was sort of remarked and used in different ways. So it was, for example, if we're looking maybe not in the space of kind of coffee houses, but consumption of coffee among the working classes, it was noted in 1660 that some workers would arrive work very sleepy because they had consumed beer for breakfast. Because again, we are in the British Isles, beer was consumed in the mornings, but then became more alert once they realized, hey, this kind of black stuff that makes me feel more alert will give me more energy for the day. So, there was this kind of general, sort of like maybe once you kind of have these different drinks mixed with sort of ale, beer, and then you have tea, this general realization that, oh, wait, if I start drinking either coffee or tea in the morning instead of beer, I might actually feel like I can do better work during the day. Who would have thought?
Maybe I should take this on board. Maybe I should cut back on my pint of beer for breakfast and start drinking
Well, I
coffee.
don't know. I'd recommend it. I personally feel a lot more alert, but it's hard to cut back, it's
Yeah,
hard to cut back, sometimes we can't just go for a pint after work. It has to be in the morning as well.
yeah, yeah.
That being said, though, the kind of taste element, sometimes we can't overplay it too much. So, for example, Nat Zapier argues that the sort of rise of this kind of coffee shop culture was also kind of a conscious imitation of the sort of Turkish coffee shop idea of this place being sort of intellectual, the coffee house being a space for intellectual and discursive culture. So it wasn't a sort of accidental development of this space taking on an association of sort of political identity because of the non-alcoholic nature of coffee, but rather it was this kind of it was a deliberate sort of social copying of what the upper classes had seen kind of happens within Turkish coffee shops, that, oh, this is a place for intellectual debate, we will do this. So
Hmm.
it has also been kind of contested, but I personally just like to stick to the theory that it's all about taste, really.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, the coffee is kind of, it has the same effects. It had the same effect on people then that it does to us now. So, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I just really hate the taste of coffee. So I prefer to go down the line that everyone who was participating in coffee drinking culture was ultimately like a bit of a hipster wannabe who was like, oh yeah, intellectual people drink coffee, I'm going to
Yeah,
drink
no.
coffee, just because that makes me feel better. because I don't
Yeah,
want to feel
yeah.
that I'm missing out on the intellectual stimulus of coffee just because I'm a wuss and I think it tastes kind of bitter.
Well, with the implication that all of us who do like coffee,
Yeah, you're all
we're all
geniuses,
just
actually.
and just wanting to be hipsters, essentially.
Well, yeah, that too.
Like the whole
Yeah.
nation of
It's
Italy
all
and
pretentious. There's not just a sort of a political element to this sort of development of an intellectual culture around coffee houses, and coffee houses don't just become sort of intellectual tokens. There's also quite a substantial religious element to coffee houses. And so coffee drinking becomes entangled with religious identity in a couple of really interesting contrasting ways. So the political radicalism, which initially went on in coffee houses in the late 17th century, was quite closely aligned with religious identities. So this goes back to our brief rundown of Restoration history. So Charles I was ousted by the Puritans, and the Puritans were very anti Charles I and his more Catholic sensibilities and his interest in marrying Catholic women. And the Puritans were very sober, very politically minded rather than sort of monarchically minded. And when the Restoration took place, Charles II explodes onto the scene and he is like just as Catholic, if not more Catholic, than his dad. And this is viewed as problematic by all those who were in favor of the Puritan regime. And so the people that Charles II is anxious about in terms of coffee houses, the reason that he clamps down on coffee houses is not just because they're having interesting chats, but because there's criticism of him. And there's a lot
mm,
of concern that the people criticizing him are Puritans. Um, and so to be in a coffee shop was to sort of, in some way, flirt with the idea of a Puritan anti-Catholic identity. And, it's really hard to escape the fact that coffee isn't alcoholic, although obviously we have now invented one of the greatest drinks known to humankind and one of the only instances in which I will willingly drink caffeine, and that is the espresso martini. And I think we should actually have a separate episode for cocktails, May. That's just throwing
I
that
think
out there.
let's
Cocktail
mark a note of
culture,
that. I
really
didn't know you
interesting.
liked espresso martinis.
Oh,
That's
I love
something
an
I feel I
espresso
should know.
martini. Yeah,
Well, I also do, but they keep me up.
yeah, well. But aside from espresso martinis, coffee has always been seen in some way as kind of a righteous alternative to alcoholic drinking. And so, yeah, part of the
Mm.
very essence of coffee houses taking off was their popularity among the Puritans. But there's also a space that religious identity kind of loops back to later, following the gin craze, was that coffee houses became popular amongst the evangelical Victorian teetotalers, the people who were really, really keen on the temperance movement, viewed beer and gin as sort of demon drink and devils in society, and saw them as sort of wreaking devastation, specifically across the working classes, um, viewed drinking in any capacity as sort of problematic because of the example that it might set to those in the lower classes, that drinking alcohol was okay, and that therefore drinking loads of beer, drinking loads of gin, and sort of the social devastation of those particular drinks at the time sort of caused. And so to drink coffee was viewed both as good for your body, as in it wasn't as bad as alcohol
Wow.
was, but it was also viewed that going to a coffee house rather than to a pub signified that you cared about the fabric of social order and you cared about the plight of the working classes. And so to just as going to a coffee house in 1678, just before they were suppressed by Charles II, sort of signified that you were maybe a religious dissenter, then going to a coffee house in 1878 also signified that you were a part of a particular religious movement, and that was evangelicalism. So I think it's really interesting that you kind of had that swing from one type of religious activism to another type of religious activism, and both of them have this identity sort of associated with coffee shops.
So coffee just kind of wanted to exist. And then it's all of a sudden,
Just being co-opted.
no, exactly, being co-opted and given different connotations for different branches of religion.
Yeah.
It's really quite interesting.
Yeah. But I feel like what's coming up through all of this is that coffee houses are becoming spaces in public where a lot of different things are taking
Mhm.
place. So you could almost say,
Almost say
that they are third
it
spaces.
became a third space. I don't know how many times we've mentioned the phrase, the very technical phrase, third space.
We should have a little, maybe in
Third
post
space count.
editing, I can have a little third space counter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
have fun with that, Ruby. Ruby has done all of the everything, I will just say, on all of the tech
nice.
side. But it's a good idea. It's a good idea. But yeah, on the third spaces, I mean, I think we've kind of, yeah, sort of seen how, so far, coffee houses, they've been used for different functions by different sort of people to kind of build their identities, etc. But this really just kind of seems to be it might be kind of obvious because it is literally a third space, but this has been a kind of a perennial theme up until sort of, very recently. So we kind of see this maybe in a very different context to the religious context that Ruby's been talking about, but with the espresso bar revival that was mentioned in the 30-second sweep in the 90s. So kind of we sort of might have mentioned, so this the rise of kind of the espresso bar, it kind of also uh, it's within this wider dialogue of what was influencing British food trends in the 90s generally. So in the latter half of the 20th century, we kind of see this rising, one of my favorite words, penchant for all
Such
things
a fun word.
Italian. And, this idea of, oh, we've had these different pieces of technology, different ideas arriving from the continent that can kind of influence sort of our society that, sort of we gradually kind of started to see that post-war. So, how this particularly influenced coffee was the introduction of gaglia. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Espresso machines that really transformed how coffee was produced within cafes or sort of espresso bars. And this became a very cool third space for Britain's youth. So the teenagers, they started to frequent these espresso bars within the sort of these 60s, to the point where some historians have claimed that this kind of they were flocking pubs. They were leaving pubs more kind of for the older people, and they're like, okay, no, these espresso bars is what that's where we're gonna hang out. We're kind of cool. But then the 70s arrived and drugs and things changed again. But all that's to say is, we have these British teenagers who are kind of, going off the back of this rising curious sort of curiosity um of sort of British, of Italian cultural influences arriving in the UK. And this sort of passion for all things Italian really prevailed throughout the latter half of the 20th century when we do see the introduction of our big coffee brands now like Costa, Cafe Nero, etc. A lot of the sort of business owners who first started these different big chains, they remarked on how people were willing to pay that extra bit to say, oh, okay, right, we're going to pay a bit more to not just go to, your average kind of sandwich shop to get your, cheaply done kind of coffee, but we're going to actually go to a proper Italian coffee shop, whether that be
Mhm.
Italian or not, and pay the
Yeah.
extra bit for seven.
It's the idea of going to a Cafe Nero for proper authentic Italian
No,
coffee.
I know, exactly. When I want to feel a bit more European,
Yeah.
I go to a Cafe Nero. But yeah, so again, we kind of see this idea of third spaces. Well, third spaces, but also um, people going to different spaces because they kind of they have this aspirational idea of maybe their identity or the type of
Mhm.
person who would go to an Italian espresso bar or whatever, as opposed to just your kind of, your greasy cat type thing. So
Mhm.
yeah, there's that element to it as well.
Yeah. I think it's one of the sort of things that I found most interesting when I was researching is the fact that this idea of coffee shops being a third space is sort of really entrenched in literature about coffee shops, but it's also quite heavily debated. So we might we might all naturally just assume that coffee shops are third spaces, but historians have disagreed on this. Historians of the 19th century love talking about the private sphere and the public sphere and the contrast between the two. So the idea that there's public space and then there's the home. And coffee houses have in sort of historical discourse become quite a site for discussion about when that public and private distinction actually comes to be. So some historians who sort of fit into what we call the Whig school of history, including a guy called Habermas, they argue that coffee houses didn't just exist as a third space. They were actually kind of hugely constructive in creating this entire new sphere of British life. So it's not just that coffee houses were places where people went out of their private homes and went into a public space to have a drink. Actually, coffee houses created the concept of a public space where you might have a drink and talk to people that you were not sort of related to or affiliated to. And this actually becomes really important in Habermas's view because these are sites for intellectual discussion. So it's not just leisure that's taking place in public, and it's not just sort of socializing. It's actually the idea that there is political, intellectual stuff happening that is not happening in a home or in sort of a court. It's happening in public. And so there's this introduction of a sort of active public space, a public space where important things are happening. But scholars in the 1990s and the early noughties, like Ronald Hutton and Jonathan Scott, have argued that this is basically irrelevant, that the intellectual discussion that took place in coffee shops wasn't any different to the intellectual discussion that would take place over a dinner party in the home. And so that coffee houses were commercial spaces, but they were commercial spaces that basically functioned as a private space. They weren't really about the intermingling of people or the grandstanding of ideas in the public space. They were just places that you met somebody for a coffee. And so John Barrell has argued, based on sort of a lot of sources about, there's quite a lot of complaints written about people overhearing things that are said in coffee shops and snitching on people. So, oh, I heard so and so say this about the king and I got him arrested, and quite a lot of concern about this. And so John Barrell basically argues that, yeah, obviously coffee houses were public spaces where private conversations happened, but because it was private conversation that was happening in them, coffee houses were basically private spaces as well. And I think
I'm not gonna lie.
it's kind of meta, and I think that actually is like, that is the point of a third space, right? Like,
Mm,
a third space is a place that you can go that isn't private, but where you are still operating in basically a private capacity. If I go to a coffee shop with you and have a
mm,
chat about, my shambolic love life, then I'm kind of expecting everyone around me to politely pretend that they can't hear what I'm saying, even though they definitely
yeah,
can. So
yeah,
it is this private space, but it's public. And that, I think, is the very essence of a third space.
totally.
But one area where this private public distinction becomes really relevant is gender, which we haven't really discussed so far in this episode. And to go back to my 19th century historians and their whole thing about private and public space, they generally view women as, women were constrained to be in the private space. They couldn't really access the
Mm,
public space, and male counterparts were engaging in the public sphere. They were engaging in commerce and leisure, and very importantly, in politics. And so, if politics is happening in coffee houses and that's a public space, then women aren't there. So, this complex place of the coffee shop where the public and private sphere distinction is either being ingrained or is actually being blurred does have quite a lot of relevance to the question of gender in relation to food history.
totally. Not least kind of, sort of when we're talking about gender and kind of what women were doing, how they interacted with kind of coffee houses. There's debate among historians as to how much they were actually kind of implicated and involved with sort of coffee houses. So I would say maybe and here we're still talking about kind of their advent, but in the sort of early, within their arrival, there was this idea that they were mainly important for, kind of males, upper class, or important, or rather only available uh, for kind of men of the upper class. However, some historians have, kind of pointed out, well, working class women were working in coffee houses. So they were sort of, they existed within this space commercially. And Stephen Pincus kind of subscribes to this a bit more and says, well, if we look at the kind of the physical effects of coffee, it's not alcoholic. So actually it's this idea that, coffee is coffee shops an ideal place for women to actually take part within the kind of, the public sphere. But on the other hand, again, looking at, as women were working, were they actually able to take part in these kind of different intellectual discussions? There's actually little evidence that women were able to, but yeah, so there's little evidence that women were really kind of involved in that aspect. But um, we will kind of maybe touch on this a bit later because this starts to change. This starts to change. A spoiler ahead,
Mhm.
but yeah.
Yeah. And there's on the gender issue, we can often use the term gender in history to refer basically to like men, women, but there's
Mm,
there's complexities within
yeah, totally.
both between those categories. And one of the interesting things, again, right at the start of sort of the coffee house explosion, is that men who frequented coffee houses were critiqued for doing so because it was viewed as not being very masculine. It was
Mm,
kind of seen as effeminate because, as you just said, coffee isn't alcoholic. It doesn't tend to lead to much sort of raucous fun. It's sort of quite cerebral. And so it might have been only men in these coffee houses, but they were actually quite heavily criticized at the time. And one of the main critiques leveled against coffee houses was that they were distracting men from good old traditional English practices like fighting and getting really drunk. And, I
because
can't
those
argue
those
with
are
that.
really the markers of a good man, aren't they? Getting drunk
Yes,
and
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
fighting.
And
Yeah.
fighting and like dog fighting
Yeah.
and things like that. So honestly, if your man isn't heavily drinking and
Fighting.
cockfighting, then like quite frankly, country's going to the dogs.
Do you even have a man? Is he even a man?
I
If he
well,
doesn't do
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Really, it's so revealing seeing, it goes to show the caricatures and the stereotypes of British men now, they're all built over a very long period of time as well.
Yeah.
It goes back. It's historic.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's honestly, that is super fascinating. And, not least as well as it tells us something about, yeah, it's not just coffee, it's gender and different gendered
Oh,
ideas that are attached to the spaces. So yeah, super interesting. I think now we could probably kind of zoom out a bit, looking into more of our kind of experimental section now that we've kind of exhausted our analysis slightly of coffee houses, even though there's still so much more to say. If you
yeah.
remember last week for our experimental section, which do we have a name for this experimental section?
No.
No.
We'll come up
Well,
with a name for the
we'll come
experimental
up with a
section.
fun name. But until then, last episode for the experimental section, I cooked a Mrs. Beaton dessert recipe, which was quite fun. And this time, Ruby will be going to one of the oldest coffee house in
Yes.
Britain, according to the
Ostensibly,
websites.
yeah. Ostensibly the oldest coffee shop in the UK. But yeah, I'm gonna seamlessly cut and then you'll hear about that from me whilst I'm there.
Yes.
I've decided to call this section the tasting menu. I hope that's okay, May. I visited the Grand Cafe in Oxford, which, according to its website, is the first coffee house in England. Samuel Pepys references it, and in the Life of Times of Anthony Wood, Antiquary of Oxford, it says that in 1651 Jacob the Jew opened a coffee house at the Angel in the parish of St. Peter in East Oxon, and there it was, as by some who delighted in novelty drank. Inside the cafe itself, it is indeed quite grand and I believe retains certain original features. The ceiling is very ornate and it has big pillars and lots of gold and a tiled floor. It's certainly not cozy or hipster. As we've said, I hate coffee, so I had a cup of tea and a scone, and here's me enjoying that and trying to look casual whilst filming. For the tea and the scone, I was charged the outrageous sum of £18.95, which is insane in my opinion. The scone wasn't even that good. I was thinking back to our comments earlier about how coffee houses were cheaper than ale houses, and I did think somewhat bitterly as I left the Grand Cafe that I could have got 3 pints for the price I paid for that tea and scone. It was quite small in the Grand Cafe and quite quiet. I didn't hear much intellectual or political discourse, but I did see one professor supervising a student. I hope the professor paid the bill for their coffee. It was interesting to see this very grand environment as a coffee house, and it brought to mind what we said earlier that coffee drinking was an identity signal for intellectualism and social engagement and importance when it became du jour in England first. The people frequenting the Grand Cafe were maybe attracted by the elevated interior as much as by the coffee itself. I certainly won't be going back because I don't want to go bankrupt.
Cool.
Cool.
Okay. Well, that was fun.
Yeah, I had so much fun doing that.
Ruby, after your wonderful trip to the Oxford coffee shop, what do we have coming up?
We can begin wrapping up the episode with our small plate section because we actually have an official small plate section this week. And we did actually have some small plates questions. So May,
Yes.
Ella, shout out to Ella. Ella has asked, what is the difference between coffee houses and tea houses? Apart from the obvious that one serves coffee and the other serves tea. I'm just going to put that out there as an initial
but
answer.
even then, the lines are blurred. But no, it's a fascinating question, and I eventually I wanted to start. Well, initially I wanted to start this episode by trying to do a bit of definition of, just to be sure, this is what coffee houses, this is what tea shops are. But when you kind of looked into the distinction a bit more within the context of British history, we're really talking about different time periods of history as well. So I thought, no, let's really just leave this to small plates. So anyway, so coffee houses, kind of the sort of the bulk of the episode we've been talking about how we've been treating it as what we've been treating them as these kind of spaces where coffee was served, intellectual ideas sort of started to come about from that because it's also a space where coffee shop houses offered newspapers, pamphlets, etc. Primarily, we're talking about male-dominated spaces when they first arrived. Tea houses, and this I think warrants in itself a whole episode about tea. This kind of term takes off more within the Victorian period, and going back to our debates about gender, are very much more associated with sort of female dominated spaces. So if we think about kind of the Victorian period, especially towards the late 19th century, women are becoming ever so slightly more involved within public political discourse and exchange, mainly about suffrage. And for this, so they kind of started to have these conversations here, but also remember we also have the very strict gender mores of the Victorian period. There wasn't an acceptable kind of social space where women could congregate together and just quite rude, really. It's one of my favorite things to do, to congregate with women. But kind of going back to Mrs. Beeton from last episode and the introduction more generally and the popularity of afternoon tea within the Victorian period, which, as a reminder, was essentially a kind of mid-meal created for women while they're waiting for their husbands to kind of come back from whatever they were doing during the day. This coincided with the rise of tea rooms. So we're really talking now kind of the 1890s. So we have two main types of tea rooms. So the Lions corner houses, the first one opening in 1894, which were kind of tea houses for selling both tea and coffee, and were seen as more of a respectable space where women could a third space for women where they could kind of exchange ideas, not least also because they were started by women. So we have that in conjunction with ABC tea shops. So that stands for Aerated Bread Company, which first opened a bit earlier in 1864. And they played a massive, they were significant for particularly women who wanted to have more sort of politically, more political discussions about suffrage, for example. Margaret Corbett Margaret described ABC establishments, so ABC tea shops, as, quote, an enormous move to freedom, so associating this idea of being able to use tea shops with also this idea of this is when we're going to start talking about what we want and sort of politically aligned ideas. So yeah, to kind of give a slightly long answer, tea shops as we kind of know it in modern British history, really more of a product of the Victorian period and more of the space for women, and kind of makes up for the sort of their absence intellectually within coffee shops when coffee shops first sort of were popular in the UK.
I didn't. I love the name Aerated Bread Company. That's
Right?
that's perfect. That really says tea shop to me.
Doesn't it? You just think, I'll get a good cup
of tea from the Aerated Bread Company.
From the ABC.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow.
I think we can move on to our next question. So Clara asks, special shout out to, and because these are all our friends, I think we will just, it's everyone's going to get a
Yeah.
special shout out. Special
Yeah.
shout out to Clara. She asks, when did decaf take off as a concept? Great question.
I found this fascinating, mostly because of the final thing that I will say on decaf, which, yeah, that's a spoiler for about 45 seconds time. So decaf was an accidental invention by Ludwig Roselius. Terrible pronunciation there, but he was a German coffee merchant, and in 1903 a consignment of coffee beans was accidentally soaked in seawater. So I assume they fell off a boat en route to Germany, and they were already aware of caffeine at this point. I will just say there'd been various experimentation in the 1890s around how to extract caffeine from coffee beans for sort of medicinal purposes, but there hadn't been any experimentation into how to extract it and then still leave coffee tasting like coffee. And so Ludwig Roselius noticed when consignment of coffee beans arrived, having been soaked in seawater for quite some time, that they had lost a lot of their caffeine content, but they hadn't lost much of their flavour. And excuse me, I'll cut that.
You need a coffee, Ruby.
I need a coffee. And he did some more experimentation, some more formalized experimentation, and he patented these decaffeinated coffee beans in 1906. The sort of technology for decaffeinating coffee sort of expanded over the years, and in the 1920s, this decaffeinated coffee became very popular in the US as Sanka. That's Sanka, which is short for sans caf, very chic. And
Very
this
chic.
was part of sort of a move in the US towards sort of healthy living. But there was another group in the 1930s that was particularly interested in clean living and health, and that became borderline obsessed with decaf coffee, and that was the Nazis. And so the Nazi Party and Nazi Germany was really, really invested in developing decaf coffee and sort of promulgating it, because caffeine, along with alcohol, was viewed as sort of a toxin to the body. And if you were pursuing an appropriately strong fatherland serving clean lifestyle, especially as a woman, then you shouldn't be taking such toxins into your body. And this, I think, was just an interesting callback to when we were first talking at the start of our first episode about sort of fascist food history, and the fact that sort of fascist regimes are very interested in policing foodstuffs. And so decaf coffee really came to the point it's at today because of the industrial advancements made in sort of decaf coffee by Nazi Germany. So that's, I don't know if you'd consider that a fun fact, but it's certainly a fact.
It's certainly a fact. It's certainly an interesting fact. And yeah, again, amazing how food and its effects, they're really co-opted for different political purposes. Nothing can be left alone,
No,
essentially is the takeaway.
no.
Yes. Maybe changing tone a bit more. That was a very fascinating answer, I will say. Ben asks, what's more important for history, wine in ancient Greece or coffee bars in the Enlightenment?
Shout out to Ben.
Shout out to Ben, yes.
Shout out to Ben. I think this is just such a fun question to round off on, because it does go
Yeah.
back to sort of our main body of discussion in this episode about coffee houses, and allows me to sort of trot out one of my favourite quotes that I found when doing the research. Samuel Butler in the 1680s described coffee houses in England as a kind of Athenian school. And so I think I don't think I can make any substantiated claim as to what was more important for history, wine in ancient Greece or coffee bars in the Enlightenment, because both of them take a stimulant of some kind in a space where people can come together, mostly men, and talk about philosophy. And those ideas have then trickled down through society. I suppose if I wanted to make a big grand claim, I would say that, most human endeavor is in some way entangled with ideas put forward by Greek philosophers. So maybe wine in ancient Greece could be considered more important. But in terms of sort of concrete impact on the modern world, obviously the Enlightenment and the ideas about science, religion, and sort of political construction, quite important
Then,
to
but
the
then we're
fabric of
talking
our
about
modern
the
day
yeah,
society. And but then
yeah.
that becomes basically what was more
What
important,
was more
ancient Greek
important?
philosophy
Exactly.
or
Or
Enlightenment
the
philosophy.
Enlightenment,
Yeah.
which I think is a bit of an impossible. It's
Big, yeah.
either, well, ambitious question
Yes,
to
yes.
answer, and
And
maybe
thankfully
not worth
not
the
one about
headache.
food. But I
Exactly.
think my argument would be that actually wine and coffee both serve a similar purpose. And yeah, I think I think that's quite a nice way to round it off.
I think it's
People
a
come
great way to
together
round it off.
around food and drink to chat. At the end of the day,
Totally.
that's what food history is all about.
It's what food history is all about, and but also, yeah, I could never imagine trying to choose between wine or coffee. That is a bit of an impossible question. But
I get around
yes,
that impossible question by hating coffee, wine every time. But thank you to everyone for their questions before we get into an argument about how bad it is that I don't like coffee. So yeah, thank you to Ella and Clara and Ben. Shout out to you all. We will put out another question call for our next episode, so stay tuned to find out what that is.
yes.
But yeah, May, do you want to round us off?
I would love to round us off. Well, I think that we've been talking for quite a while about coffee, but I would say, I think all of our discussion, it all comes back to the point that it's all really about the beverage, the spaces that this beverage is consumed within, and the different identities and groups of people, or the different identities that are sort of formed as different groups of people enter into these spaces. So this discussion about coffee, it all really just goes back to, different groups of people have occupied coffee houses or cafes at different points of time, and they've carried very kind of different identities, political associations, social associations throughout it. So it's never just about the drink, but the space that the drink is consumed within, and how society treats and views sort of the people who occupy those spaces, let alone the identities that they try to create for themselves. Yes, coffee really, it became du jour in the mid starting mid 70s, but kind of necessarily, coffee houses, they're a necessary space, and it is still du jour today. Coffee is perennial.
Indeed, it is.
Indeed it is.
Next time
Mm-hmm.
on the menu for du jour, we're going to be discussing convenience food,
I'm
which is going to be
so
very fun.
excited. Which
Takes
is
us
also
sort of a bit of a jump forward in history, but yeah,
perhaps, but also I'm kind of excited to see how convenience food might also be a bit perennial as well. But we'll
yeah.
see.
It'll also be probably the most fun doing the experimental section of that
Oh my gosh, I
because I
can't
do
wait.
mostly plan on going and getting some chips from the van on the Oxford High Street that
I was
I
thinking a meal
like.
deal.
Well, you know what? We can
Yeah.
both experiment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. We'll come back to
fantastic.
it. But yes, thank you so much for listening,
As ever.
and as ever, and see you next time.
Yeah.
Also, I'm waiting to the very end of this episode. The bird is not mine. The bird is not mine. I was meant to say that at the beginning, the bird is not mine, for people who are still here and still watching.
I want to christen the bird though. What should we call the bird?
Steve.
Okay, Steve the bird.
Thanks,
Well,
Steve.
I've been Ruby, she's been May, and he's been Steve. And thank you very
Indeed.
much for listening.
Thank you very much.